Last year, I made a video where I talked about my favorite games of 2019, so I figured I'd do the same for 2020. With the ongoing state of the world, this was an incredibly unusual year to say the least, but in terms of the gaming industry, there were still a surprising amount of major releases. For this list, I'll be including remakes and re-releases with significant amounts of additional content, but not remasters or ports. Unlike last year's video, I'll also only be focusing on the games I finished. With that being said, here are my favorite games of 2020. Overall, my favorite game of the year was Persona 5 Royal. The original P5 is one of my favorite games of 2017, and Royal improves upon it in almost every way. Despite occasional burnout from having spent over 80 hours on the original, it was absolutely worth experiencing it again for the new scenes throughout, and especially for the endgame content. The new characters and storylines were fantastic, and the changes and additions to the gameplay made it a much better experience for the most part. The amount of quality of life improvements to the gameplay and the expanded story made Royal an even better version of an already incredible game. As a fan of both Breath of the Wild and the original Hyrule Warriors, I really enjoyed Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, despite its performance issues. Even though the combat and exploration felt fairly basic, I appreciated how many elements were brought in from Breath of the Wild. While the gameplay was fun, I was mostly invested in the story. It wasn't particularly outstanding, but I enjoyed a lot of the character moments and even the game's unusual premise. Outside of its unstable framerate, I mostly adored Age of Calamity as an entertaining action game and for how it contributed to the setting and characters of Breath of the Wild. I was cautiously optimistic towards Paper Mario The Origami King when it was first announced, but I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. I ended up liking the characters and writing a lot, despite the lack of unique character designs and some moments that fell a bit flat. The core gameplay and exploration were also really fun, and even though the regular battle system could be a bit tedious, the real-time battles and the boss encounters were mostly fun. Aside from a few issues, I was incredibly impressed by how thoroughly charming and entertaining The Origami King was. I don't have a strong attachment to the original, but I really liked Final Fantasy VII Remake. While I liked the real-time combat and many of the alterations or additions to the story, one of my favorite elements was how faithful the main character portrayals were, while also improving a lot of the supporting cast. On the other hand, some of the new or extended gameplay sequences felt too long and interrupted the pacing of the story. Despite this, Final Fantasy VII Remake was still a great experience for the most part, and I'm cautiously excited to see where this interpretation goes in the future. As someone who still plays Animal Crossing New Horizons daily, I like the greater level of customization and other new features, and despite the lack of content at launch, a lot has already been added through frequent updates. It's still a bit bare bones, but I'm hoping some highly requested quality of life improvements and beloved characters are introduced in the near future. My other major issue is it has less personality than its predecessors, with less lively and interesting conversations with villagers. Even though there's a lot of room for improvement, I'm still enjoying New Horizons as a relaxing game that happened to release at a very stressful time. One of the more unique games I played this year was Helltaker, a quirky puzzle game with visual novel elements. Even though it's an incredibly short game, some of the stages were fairly challenging, with an extremely limited number of moves to reach the goal, and even multiple solutions in specific levels. As fun as the puzzles were, I felt like the main appeal was the unique setting and eccentric characters. For a free-to-play title that can be finished in under an hour, Helltaker was surprisingly fun for its clever writing and solid level design. For the most part, Resident Evil 3 was an entertaining follow-up to one of my favorite games from last year. Despite reusing a lot from Resident Evil 2, the gameplay felt more action-oriented and fast-paced, with more varied combat and a greater emphasis on cinematic moments. This change in tone caused it to feel a bit shallow at times, with an overall shorter length and an abundance of linear scripted sequences. I also thought too much was left out from the original, but as its own game, Resident Evil 3 was enjoyable while it lasted. Finally, there's Shantae and the Seven Sirens. Compared to the previous games in the series, this game felt much more like a full-blown Metroidvania, with a large interconnected map and a variety of unlockable abilities throughout the adventure. Even though it was mostly fun, it was also frustrating at times, mainly because of excessive backtracking from having no way to keep track of item locations on the map. The story and writing were fun too, but the constant alternating between voice and text-only dialogue was really distracting. Even with these issues, I still liked Seven Sirens as a fan of the series and the characters. Those were all of the new releases that I finished in 2020. Surprisingly, I think I played more new games in 2020 than in 2019. A lot of my favorite series got new entries, and even though many of them were fairly polarizing, I enjoyed pretty much every game I played to varying degrees. Additionally, there were quite a few games I haven't finished yet, including Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition and Genshin Impact, and some I haven't even tried at all yet, including Hades, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, and 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. Overall, despite everything else throughout the year, I thought 2020 was an unexpectedly solid year for video game releases. With the ongoing pandemic, I'm not sure what to expect from 2021 in terms of the gaming industry. I'm looking forward to quite a few games already, especially as developers start to fully utilize next-gen hardware, but I would not be surprised if there are a lot of delays or rushed games. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, stay safe, and thank you for watching.